"You will come with me," the lonely herder said to the crow woman standing alone in the flea market. The market was alive with the hustle and bustle of people walking through the crowded streets, looking at various goods that vendors offered on old wooden tables. There was an endless array of things for sale: handmade jewelry, old clothes, trinkets, and second-hand books, each item telling a different story, each a piece of the past. The sun beat down, casting long shadows between the tents and stalls. The air was thick with dust, mixing with the smells of food and the chatter of the market-goers. It was the kind of place where faces came and went, fleeting and unnoticed, and no one paid much attention to the lonely figures who roamed its edges. Among the crowd, one figure stood out, a woman dressed in worn leather, a long scarf wrapped around her head, hiding the sharp features of her face.
She wasn't like the others.
Her eyes, dark and watchful, moved slowly over the market as if she was searching for something. She didn't rush, didn't bargain with the vendors, and didn't smile. Her movements were measured, almost deliberate, as though every step she took had meaning. She was alone, just as she had always been. Breath.
He glances around in desperate. She was used to it.
She was a crow woman, a descendant of a proud and ancient people, and the world around her had always seemed a little too loud, a little too fast. She moved through life with a quiet purpose, avoiding the noise and chaos that came with being in crowded places like this. But most of the time, she preferred to stay away from people. The market was no different. But today, something had drawn her here. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe the promise of something new, or maybe it was the feeling of being a stranger among strangers. Raven paused in front of an old wooden stall filled with trinkets and broken watches. The vendor, an older man with a thick beard, smiled at her as she picked up a faded postcard and examined it. The man noticed her long, dark coat and the strange look in her eyes. "Looking for something special, ma'am?" he asked, his voice thick with the dust of the market. Raven didn't answer him immediately, the postcard over in her hands, her fingers tracing the edges. It was a picture of a place far away, a place that wasn't familiar to her. Something about it seemed almost out of reach, as if it didn't belong to this world.
"No," she finally replied in a low, soft voice.
"Just looking." She placed the card back on the table and walked away, her steps quiet and purposeful. The man's voice trailed off behind her, but she didn't turn back. She never did. Raven didn't need to be noticed, didn't need the attention of others. Breath. She had lived much of her life like this, blending into the shadows, observing, but never truly part of the crowd. As she walked down the dusty lane, a strange feeling came over her, a sense that something was about to happen, but she didn't know why. But the feeling was so strong that it made her heart beat a little faster. Maybe it was the way the sunlight shifted, or the way the wind whispered through the cracks in the market. Whatever it was, it made her stop. She had always trusted her instincts, and right now her instincts were telling her that this was not just another day at the market. She glanced around, her sharp eyes scanning the crowd. And then she saw him. The man was tall, with a broad frame and a rough, weathered face. His clothes were simple but practical: worn boots, a faded shirt, and a long coat that looked like it had seen its fair share of harsh weather. He stood alone, just a few feet away, watching her with a kind of quiet intensity. There was something in his eyes that caught her attention, something she couldn't place but that felt strangely familiar. It was not the way most men looked at her. Most men either ignored her or looked at her with curiosity. But this man, this stranger, seemed different. He had the look of someone who had lived a hard life, someone who had spent more time in the wilderness than in the company of others. His hair was dark, streaked with gray, and his face was lined with the marks of time and experience.
But it wasn't just his appearance that made him stand out. It was the way he carried himself, as if he was used to being alone, just as she was. For a moment, their eyes locked. Raven felt an odd jolt, as if something was shifting in the air between them. The man didn't smile, didn't say anything, but he didn't look away either. He simply watched her, waiting, as if he had been expecting her all along. And then, just as quickly as the moment had arrived, he spoke. His voice was low, but clear, and it cut through the noise of the market as though no one else existed. "You will come with me," he said, his words simple, but with an authority that made Raven pause. She blinked, taken aback by his sudden statement. She had heard many things in her life, but never had anyone spoken to her like that, as if there was no question, no hesitation. The words hung in the air, thick with meaning, and Raven felt a strange pull inside her, something that made her heart race. She wasn't sure if it was fear or curiosity, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this moment was more than just a chance encounter. The herder, the man who had spoken to her, took a step closer, his boots heavy against the ground. There was no warmth in his voice, no softness, just the weight of something that needed to be said. His eyes didn't leave hers as he added, "I'm not asking, I'm telling you, but you don't belong here." Raven stood still, her mind racing as she tried to process his words. Grasp. What did he mean by "you don't belong here"? Who was he to tell her where she belonged? And yet, there was something in his eyes that made her hesitate. Something that made her feel as though maybe, just maybe, he was right. She glanced around the market again, taking in the familiar faces, the familiar noise. It was all the same. It was always the same. Breaths. She had been drifting through life like this for years, alone, always on the edge of things, never truly part of anything. But here, in this moment, with this man standing before her, it felt like everything had changed. "I have no place here," he continued, his voice softer now. "I'm a herder. I live alone. And so do you. We're both searching for something we can't find in places like this. Come with me. Bray, you don't have to be alone anymore."
Raven felt her chest tighten at his words.
Breaths. She didn't know if it was anger or sadness, or perhaps both, but something stirred deep within her. She had spent so long keeping her distance from others, building walls around herself, but now this man was asking her to come with him, to follow him into a life she didn't fully understand. For a long moment, Raven didn't speak. She only stood there, her eyes locked with his, weighing his words against the life she had known. She could walk away, as she had always done, disappearing into the crowds, blending back into the world that never seemed to see her. But something about his presence, something about his voice, made her wonder if this was the moment she had been waiting for all along. Finally, Raven nodded, her decision made. She didn't know where this path would lead, or what would happen next, but for the first time in years, she felt like there was something worth following. She would go with him. Brave. She would take the first step towards something new, something different, something that might just change everything. Without another word, she turned and walked toward him, her footsteps light but determined, and together they left the market behind, stepping into the unknown, where their lives would intertwine in ways neither of them could yet imagine. Raven walked beside the herder as they left the crowded market behind. The noise of the busy streets, the chatter of voices, and the clinking of coins grew quieter with each step. Brands. Soon the world of the bustling marketplace was nothing more than a distant hum, swallowed up by the vast open space ahead of them. The land stretched out before her, an endless horizon of rolling hills and dry earth, where only the occasional tree stood tall against the harsh winds. Raven had grown up among such lands, though she had always been on the edges, watching but never fully part of it. She was used to the wildness of the world, but this place, this land, felt different. It was quieter, emptier, in a way that made her feel like an outsider despite the familiarity of the land itself. The herder, whose name was Elias, led the way on horseback, his movements calm and steady. Raven followed on foot, her steps echoing in the stillness. They didn't speak. Not at first. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was simply the kind of silence that came with the land itself. It was the kind of silence Raven had always known, but there was something about it now that felt charged with a quiet intensity. After walking for what felt like hours, the land began to change. The dry, barren soil gave way to fields, the air growing cooler as they moved further from the market. The hills were taller now, and the wind carried with it the scent of wild flowers and fresh earth. Raven glanced around, taking in the new surroundings. It was peaceful here, almost too peaceful. It was a far cry from the crowded market, but it also felt empty in its own way. Empty of life, empty of connection. They came to a stop at the base of a small hill, where a modest cabin stood alone, surrounded by a few scattered animals grazing on the grass. The cabin was simple, made of weathered wood, with a stone chimney that puffed out a thin trail of smoke. It looked as though it had been built by hand, piece by piece, with care and patience. This was Elias's home. Raven stood at the foot of the hill, her eyes studying the cabin. It wasn't much, but it was a home. She wondered if this was truly where she was meant to be, whether she was meant to stay here, in this quiet place with this quiet man, living a life she had never known before. She wasn't sure, but something in her gut told her that this might be her chance to find something she had long since given up on. Peace. Elias dismounted his horse and walked toward the cabin. Raven hesitated for a moment before following him. She had no idea what she was doing here or why she had agreed to come with him. But now that she was here, there was no turning back. Inside the cabin, the air was warm and smelled of wood smoke and earth. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The furnishings were simple: a worn wooden table, a couple of chairs, and a few shelves lined with books and old tools. There was a sense of order to the place, but it wasn't the kind of order you found in a bustling town. It was the kind of order that came from years of living alone, of learning to make do with what you had. Elias gestured for Raven to sit at the table, and she did, her movements slow, her thoughts racing. She didn't know what to say, what to do. She had always been a woman of action, someone who didn't waste time with words. But here in this quiet home, she found herself at a loss. Elias sat across from her, his eyes studying her carefully. "You're wondering why I brought you here," he said quietly, as though he had read her mind. Raven nodded, though she wasn't sure how to phrase the question that had been swirling in her head since the moment he had spoken those words to her in the market.
"Why did you ask me to come with you?" she asked, her voice soft but steady.
Elias leaned back in his chair, his weathered hands resting on the table in front of him. He didn't immediately answer. Instead, he took a deep breath and looked out the window, his eyes distant as if he were searching for something beyond the walls of the cabin. "I've spent many years alone," he said finally, his voice low, almost reluctant. "I've lived a life of solitude by choice, but over time it starts to feel like a prison. You can only keep running from your own thoughts for so long before they catch up to you." know what it means to live without the world around you. Someone who knows what it's like to be alone, but not by choice." Raven listened carefully, her eyes not leaving his face. She had spent much of her life alone, too, though her solitude had always been self-imposed. Breaths. She understood what he meant, how loneliness could feel like a constant weight pressing down on you until you felt as if you were sinking under it.
"I don't need company just to have someone by my side," Elias continued.
Bray, I need someone who understands that kind of silence, that kind of solitude. Someone who doesn't need to fill the space with words or noise.
I saw that in you at the market. You're like me.
Alone, but not by choice. And I thought maybe you'd understand. Raven sat back in her chair, her mind processing his words. She had never expected to hear anything like this from him. A man who had barely spoken to her since they left the market. Bastix. And yet there was something in his words that resonated deeply within her. She had never spoken of her own loneliness. Not to anyone. It was a part of her that she had kept hidden, a wound that she didn't allow to be seen.
You're not the only one who knows that kind of loneliness, Raven said quietly, her voice barely a whisper.
I've spent most of my life on the edge of things, never fully belonging to anyone. I'm used to being alone.
Elias looked at her then, his gaze softening.
He nodded slowly, as if he understood exactly what she meant. For a moment neither of them spoke. The fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth the only sound in the room. Eventually Elias stood and walked to the small kitchen, where a pot of stew simmered on the stove. Breaths. You must be hungry, he said, his voice breaking the silence. Raven nodded, though she wasn't sure if it was hunger she felt or simply the need for something to occupy her thoughts. As Elias served them both, Raven's mind drifted back to the market, to the moment when he had spoken to her. His words still echoed in her ears. You will come with me. It had been a command, not a request. And yet something in her had made her listen, made her follow him. As they ate, the conversation shifted to more practical matters. What needed to be done around the cabin, the animals that Elias tended to, the crops he grew. It was a quiet, peaceful life, one that didn't require much talking but instead required patience and hard work. Raven could see that it was a life Elias had built for himself, one that allowed him to live in solitude but still maintain the connection to the land that he needed. And as the night wore on, Raven began to realize something. This place, this simple cabin on the edge of the world, might just be the one place where she could find what she had been searching for all these years. Peace. It wasn't the life she had imagined for herself, but it was real. And in a strange way, it felt like a new beginning. The days that followed were calm, perhaps too calm. Raven found herself adjusting to the quiet rhythm of Elias's life. There were no bustling crowds, no endless chatter. There were only the sounds of nature, the wind rustling through the trees, the distant calls of birds, the soft lowing of cattle in the fields, and the occasional clip-clop of hooves as Elias tended to his animals. Each morning they woke early. The sun had just begun to rise over the hills, casting a warm golden light across the land. Elias would start a fire in the hearth while Raven prepared breakfast. The tasks were simple, but there was something deeply grounding about the routine. It was a life far from the noisy, crowded world she had left behind. Here, in this secluded place, time seemed to slow down. Elias showed her how to care for the animals, teaching her how to saddle the horses, feed the cattle, and gather eggs from the chicken coop. It wasn't difficult work, but it was demanding in its own way. There was no room for distractions, no time for wandering thoughts. Purpose. Every movement had a purpose. Every movement had meaning. In the stillness of the land, Raven felt as if she was learning to become part of something bigger than herself, a rhythm that flowed with the land, with the seasons, and with the animals that lived on it. But there were moments when the silence felt too heavy, too thick in the air.
At night, after dinner, as they sat by the fire, Raven couldn't help but wonder about the man sitting across from her.
Breath. Elias never spoke much of himself. He would share stories about the land, the animals, and the weather, but when it came to his past, there was nothing but silence. He never spoke of his family, his friends, or where he had come from. It was as though his life before the ranch didn't matter, as if it had been wiped clean by time and solitude. Raven was used to silence. She had always been a quiet person. But there was something about Elias's quietness that felt different. Right. It wasn't peaceful silence. It was a silence born of sorrow, of something hidden. She had learned not to ask too many questions, to let him keep his secrets. But deep inside, a part of her longed to know more. She wanted to understand what had shaped him, what had brought him to this place of solitude.
One afternoon, while Elias was out repairing a fence, Raven wandered to the edge of the property, drawn by the sight of a distant hill.
From where she stood, she could see the land stretch out in all directions. Endless fields, wild forests, and the distant mountains rising up against the sky. It was beautiful, breathtaking in its vastness, but there was something unsettling about it, too. The emptiness, the isolation, weighed heavily on her heart. Round, in desperation, she sat down on a rock, the wind tugging at her hair, and closed her eyes for a moment. The wind carried the scent of pine and earth, and for the first time since she had arrived, Raven felt a strange sense of peace wash over her.
She had always been drawn to the wildness of the land, but it was different here. It was as if the land itself was alive, breathing, watching over them.
When Elias returned, he found her sitting quietly on the rock, her gaze fixed on the horizon. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, watching her. There was a comfort in the way he let her be, in the way he respected her silence. But after a few moments, he spoke softly. "This place is different," he said, his voice low and thoughtful. Raven turned to look at him, but she didn't answer right away. She had heard him speak of the land before, of its beauty and its hardships, but she sensed that this time there was something more in his words. "It's more than just land," Elias continued. "It's a part of me, a part of my soul. This place is what keeps me going, keeps me from losing myself completely." Raven studied him carefully, trying to understand what he meant. He had never been this open with her before, and she could feel the weight behind his words. She didn't know if he was speaking about the land itself or if he was speaking of something deeper, something more personal. "But what happened to you?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. "Before all this." "This quiet?"
Elias's face hardened for a moment, his eyes darkening as if he were retreating into a memory he didn't want to relive. For a long time he didn't speak, and Raven wondered if she had overstepped, if she had asked too much.
Finally he answered, his voice barely a whisper. "I lost my family, my wife, my children. I lost them all in a way that left nothing behind but emptiness. This place, this land, it's all I have left now." Raven felt a pang of sympathy for him. She had known loss, too, but nothing like what Elias had endured. She had lost her parents when she was young, but it was a different kind of loss, one she had been able to accept over time. Elias's loss seemed to have carved a deep wound into his soul, one that had never healed. "Harish, I'm sorry," she said quietly, her words simple but sincere. "I didn't mean to bring up painful memories." Elias shook his head, the ghost of a smile flickering on his lips.
"It's all right. I've learned to live with it.
I don't talk about it often, but sometimes it helps to remember what I had, even if it's gone now." The silence between them stretched again, but it wasn't uncomfortable. There was an understanding between them now, an unspoken connection born out of shared solitude and unspoken pain. by Elias had opened up in a way he never had before, and Raven felt a sense of gratitude for that, even though she couldn't fully understand the depth of his grief. After that day, things shifted between them. Elias was still a man of few words, but there was a softness in his gaze whenever he looked at Raven. He seemed less guarded, less distant, as if sharing his pain had made room for something new. And Raven, too, began to open up in small ways. She shared stories from her childhood, of the traditions of her people, of the struggles she had faced. She didn't speak of her own loss, the loss of her family, but there was something comforting about the way Elias listened, as if he understood that some things couldn't be said aloud. The work on the ranch continued. There were days when the silence between them was filled with the steady rhythm of their chores, and other days when words were exchanged in quiet conversation. Raven had come to realize that this life of solitude and quiet work, was exactly what she needed. Narration. It wasn't a perfect life, and it wasn't the life she had envisioned for herself. But it was real. It was honest. And for the first time in a long time, Raven felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. As the weeks passed, the land began to change with the seasons. The once dry fields grew lush with green, the wild flowers blossomed, and the air became warmer. Elias and Raven worked side by side, their movements in sync, as if they had been doing this for years instead of just a few weeks. There was no rush, no pressure, just the work of the land and the quiet companionship they had found in each other. And yet, even in the peace of this life, Raven could feel the weight of something deeper, something that still lay between them. It wasn't just their shared silence or their shared grief. It was something unspoken, a connection that neither of them had fully explored. But for now, they were content to let it be, knowing that in time, the answers would come, just as the seasons changed and the land continued its eternal cycle. The days were slowly stretching into weeks, and the ranch, once a foreign place to Raven, was beginning to feel more like home. The hard work of caring for the animals, maintaining the property, and living in the quiet of the land had a rhythm to it now, one that Raven understood. The seasons were changing, the earth beneath her feet warming, and in her heart she could feel the stirrings of something new. Elias, too, had fallen into the routine of their shared life. He no longer looked at her with the distance he once had, and his moments of quiet reflection were fewer now. There was a sense of peace between them, even when words weren't spoken. It was as though they were two people bound by the land, by the shared solitude, and by an understanding that didn't need to be explained. One afternoon, Raven found herself at the edge of the property, near the small pond that Elias had told her about when they first arrived. It was one of his favorite places, a spot where he often went to think. But something about the quiet of the afternoon drew her there now. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the still water. As she approached the pond, Raven could see the reflection of the trees and the sky mirrored perfectly in the water's surface. The air was still, almost too still, as though the entire world was holding its breath. Raven knelt by the edge of the pond, letting her fingers graze the surface of the water. It was cool to the touch, a refreshing contrast to the warmth of the sun. She thought about the life she had left behind, the crowded streets of the market, the endless noise of the world, and the empty spaces inside her that had never been filled. She thought about Elias, too. He had given her the space to be herself, to heal, and in return she had found a deep respect for him. But there was still so much she didn't know about him, how much he had yet to share. She wondered often if the land had truly healed him, or if it had only covered up the wounds that ran deep in his heart. Just as she was lost in thought, she heard the sound of footsteps behind her. Elias had appeared at the edge of the pond, his figure silhouetted against the golden light of the setting sun, watching her as if unsure whether to approach. Raven didn't turn to look at him right away. Raven didn't turn to look at him right away. She kept her gaze fixed on the water, letting the stillness settle between them. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was just another part of the quiet they had both learned to live with. Finally, Elias spoke. "It's peaceful here, isn't it?" Raven nodded. "It is. I've never known silence like this." Elias walked over to her, his boots crunching softly on the ground as he approached. He knelt beside her, his gaze following hers to the water. For a long while neither of them spoke. The only sound was the gentle rustling of the leaves in the wind, and the soft trickle of water as it moved along the edges of the pond.
"I used to come here often,"
Elias said after a while, his voice barely above a whisper. Desk.
"When things were harder, when I needed to think. It was the one place where I could feel like I wasn't alone." Raven turned to look at him, her eyes searching his face for the emotions that lingered behind his words.
There was something in his expression, something deep and old that she couldn't quite place. It was as though the quiet had always been a part of him, a shield that kept the world at bay.
"I'm not alone anymore," Elias continued, his eyes meeting hers. "And neither are you."
Raven didn't know what to say. She didn't have the words to explain how she felt, how she had come to rely on the stillness of this place, or how Elias had become an anchor in a life that had once been filled with nothing but uncertainty. She simply nodded, her heart full in a way she couldn't describe. They sat there for a while, just the two of them, watching the sun dip lower in the sky. The world around them seemed to slow, and in the silence of that moment, Raven could feel the tension in her chest begin to loosen. She had spent so much of her life holding her breath, waiting for something to change. But here, in the quiet of the ranch, it felt as though the change had already happened without her even realizing it. Later that evening, as they sat by the fire, the warmth of the flames filling the cabin with a soft glow, Raven found herself thinking about the future. She had never been one to plan ahead, to think about what might come next. But now, with the land beneath her feet and the quiet comfort of Elias's presence, she began to wonder what her life might look like in the years to come. Would she stay here? Would she continue to share this peaceful solitude with Elias? Or would she one day leave, driven by the pull of the world beyond? Elias seemed to sense her thoughts. He looked at her across the fire, his face illuminated by the flickering light.
"You know, Raven," he said softly, "this place, it's not just mine."
"It's yours too, if you want it." Raven met his gaze, her heart pounding in her chest.
She had never expected him to say something like that. The words were simple, but the weight behind them was heavy. It was an invitation, a gift, but also a challenge. To truly belong, to make a life for herself here, she would have to open herself to it, fully and completely. Desper. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I didn't know if I belonged anywhere. But here with you, it feels like I could." The fire crackled in the background, and the warmth of it spread through her, filling the empty spaces inside her that she had long since given up on ever feeling. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time she felt like she had a place. It wasn't perfect, Brett. It wasn't easy. But it was real, and that was enough. Elias smiled, a rare smile that reached his eyes. It was the first time she had seen it so clearly. "Then we'll make a life here, together. You and me. The land, the animals, the quiet, all of it." Raven nodded, a sense of peace settling in her heart. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, or the next day, or the day after that. But for now, for this moment, she was exactly where she needed to be. As the fire burned low and the night stretched on, the two of them sat together in silence, not needing to speak to understand what had been shared between them. It was a silence that felt full, rich with possibility and connection. The world outside might be uncertain, but here, in this quiet place, Raven knew she had found something worth holding on to. Passed, quietly, marked more by weather than by dates. Winter loosened its grip on the land, and the hills slowly changed color. The woman noticed these changes before the man did. She paid attention to small things, the sound of birds returning, the way the sheep spread out farther each morning, the light staying longer in the sky. Life on the land had a rhythm, and she had learned how to move within it without forcing herself into it. The herder watched her from a distance at first. He did not know how to ask questions that were not practical. He noticed that she woke early without being told, that she worked steadily without complaint, and that she spent her evenings writing in a small notebook she kept folded in her bag. He never asked what she wrote. He had learned slowly that not everything needed to be spoken. They shared meals most days, sitting at the small wooden table near the window. The conversations were simple. They talked about the animals, the weather, and what supplies were running low. Sometimes they spoke about the nearby town, but neither of them felt much pull toward it. Silence often filled the space between them, but it was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that came from understanding there was no rush. Rabot, the woman, thought often about the day they met. She remembered how his words had sounded firm but empty, like someone repeating something they had practiced but never used before. At the time, she had not trusted him. She still did not trust easily. But she trusted the routine, and she trusted what she could see. He never tried to control her movements. He never spoke as if she owed him something. When she asked questions, he answered honestly, even when the truth was not impressive. One evening after dinner, she told him she planned to visit the town the next week. She said it casually, as if it were a small errand. The herder nodded and asked if she needed the truck. His response surprised her more than anger would have. There was no tension in his voice, no fear that she would not return. That night, she realized something had changed. Not between them exactly, but within herself. She was no longer measuring her days by what she might lose. She was thinking about what she wanted to choose. The trip to town reminded her how loud the world could be. Cars passed too close. People spoke quickly and did not wait for answers. She visited a few familiar places, spoke to an old friend, and sold some of her bedwork. The money was modest, but the conversation stayed with her longer. Desperate. Someone asked her where she was living now. She answered honestly. The words felt steady in her mouth. When she returned to the land, the herder was repairing a fence. He looked up when he saw the truck and gave a small wave. That simple gesture stayed with her. He did not ask how long she had been gone. He did not ask what she had done. He only asked if the road was clear. That night, she slept deeply, without dreams. As spring moved forward, the woman began to imagine different futures for helping through the next season, learning more about the land and the work. Other times, she imagined leaving in the fall, traveling again with a clearer sense of direction. What mattered was that both possibilities felt open. She was no longer choosing between fear and survival. She was choosing between paths. The herder also changed, though he did not name it that way. He found himself noticing his own habits. He cleaned the house more often. Desperate, he repaired things he had ignored for years. He spoke more, not because he felt pressured, but because he realized he had thoughts worth sharing. Her presence did not fill his loneliness, but it showed him where it lived.
One afternoon, as they walked along the edge of the field, he told her about his childhood.
It was not a long story. He spoke about leaving home early, about learning to work before learning how to speak to people.
He admitted that he had not known how to ask someone to stay, only how to state it as a fact. She listened without interrupting.
When he finished, she thanked him for telling her. That was the moment they both understood that whatever this arrangement had been, it was no longer accidental.
Later that week, she told him she needed to make a decision, soon. She did not frame it as a warning.
She spoke calmly, clearly. She said she valued what they had built, but she needed to choose her next step with intention.
The herder listened carefully. He did not argue. He did not bargain. He told her that whatever she chose, he would respect it. The simplicity of his response made the decision harder, not easier.
She spent several days walking alone, sitting near the hills and writing in her notebook.
She thought about the places she had been and the ways she had survived. She thought about how often she had been spoken for, spoken over, or spoken to without being seen. Here, she had been seen quietly.
That mattered. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady.
She told him she would stay through the next season, not as an unspoken agreement, but as a clear choice. She also said that when the time came, she would leave if she felt the need.
He agreed without hesitation. There was no promise beyond honesty.
The season passed with fewer words and deeper understanding. They worked together well. They disagreed sometimes, but they learned how to pause instead of pushing. The land responded to their care.
The animals stay healthy! The house felt lived in!
As summer faded, the woman prepared again to go to town. This time, it was not to escape or test her freedom. It was simply part of her life. She packed lightly and told the herder when she would return.
He nodded and told her to drive safely. Watching her leave, he felt something unfamiliar but not painful.
It was the knowledge that connection did not mean possession. He returned to his work with a steadier hand. When she came back days later, the land looked the same, but both of them had changed just enough to notice. There was no dramatic ending, no final declaration. What remained was choice, respect, and the understanding that belonging could be shaped slowly, without force. They had not solved loneliness or displacement. They had learned how to meet them honestly. And for both of them, that was enough to move forward. Developer mode. ChatGPT can make mistakes. Check important info.